Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us at our webinar entitled System Selection, Make the Right Move for Your Organization, or as I like to say, how to get the CRM system you've always wanted. We're happy that you've been able to take time out of your busy day to join us as we talk about the process of selecting a new CRM system for your organization. Before we get started, there are a few housekeeping notes. Everyone will be muted during the webinar, and we are going to have time for Q&A at the end. So you can use the chat window as we go along to submit questions as they occur to you, and we'll be happy to answer them at the end of the presentation. My name is Donna Caputo. I'm the Managing Director of Consulting Services at JCA. I've been with JCA guiding nonprofits toward operational efficiency for over 20 years. At JCA, we work to help organizations put people, processes, and systems together for the most effective outcomes. We run system selections, system implementations, business process assessments, and reorganization projects, to name a few. And I'm here today with my friend Robert Weiner. Robert is an independent consultant who specializes in helping nonprofit professionals make informed strategic decisions about information technology like CRM systems, association management software, and email marketing software. Robert has consulted with a wide variety of nonprofit organizations. He's the host of TechSoup's Databases and Software Forum. He's a founding member and current board member of the Association of Advancement Services Professionals, and he's a frequent speaker on nonprofit software and best practices in fundraising data management. And together we are going to cover the process for selecting a new CRM software solution and share some of the ways in which that selection can go wrong, so you can be completely prepared as you begin your selection project. Here's our agenda for today. First, I'll walk you through the key components of a system selection, and we'll talk a little bit about the things that an organization should do and organizations should not do. Then Robert will share with us the 10 common mistakes of system selections that he has seen over the years. And as I said, we'll answer your questions at the end. Our hope is that we can help you be prepared to run a top quality selection that will get you the system your organization needs. So let's get started. A system selection has two main components. Number one, figure out what you need. And number two, find the solution that fits best and buy it. Well, that's easy, right? Well, let's take a look at each component. Number one, figure out what you need. This is the core foundational work of a system selection. And how do you figure out what you need? It's more than just saying, hey, I think we need a new system. Sometimes there is a general feeling that a current system just doesn't work well enough, and having that understanding is important. But an organization really needs to be able to identify what the new system needs to do on its behalf. And answering that question about what a system really needs to do means documenting your requirements. Everything that comes after documenting your requirements is based on those requirements. And what that means is that the quality of work you do upfront, gathering and documenting your requirements, is going to directly affect the quality of your selection. In order to get all of your requirements identified and written down, you'll undertake a process of interviewing your colleagues and gathering functional system requirements from all relevant business units. And as you go through the process of thinking through how a system should support your activities and specifically what you need it to do, you'll also need to determine priorities. And it's important as well to note if there is a department or an individual who owns a particular requirement or a set of requirements. This will enable you to go back and ask questions, to further refine, and to determine the importance of a requirement. Because in the end, it's important not to let a requirement that is on someone's wish list, for example, sway the grading and decision-making process. Now, the second component is finding the best fit. And to find the best fit, you will use your requirements to help vendors display their system's ability to meet your organization's needs. Typically, you'll create an RFP or an RFI. You'll send it to as many vendors as you determine are appropriate. You'll receive and analyze their responses. And at this point, you will most likely cut the list. You'll invite the remaining vendors to demo their products. You'll grade what you see and make your decision. Now, there are some do's and don'ts of requirements building, and here are some of the do's. Do break up your requirements gathering activities into functional areas. Hold working sessions with each business unit to capture their needs, and then ask them to verify that you heard them correctly once you have their requirements on paper. Work group by group to make sure that you include specifics for event fundraising, for example, that you might miss if you happen to spend most of your day thinking about standard gift processing. Once you have all your requirements documented, categorize them in terms of a main stakeholder, unless they're general and pertain to everyone. Then establish priority for each requirement. You could think of this in terms of, hey, this is definitely needed, or this would be nice to have, but maybe we could live without it, or this one here is totally a wish list item. Choose a numeric ranking system. Decide what each score means. So like if you're using a 5-point scale, what does 1 mean? What does 5 mean? Make sure everybody understands how to score, and then prioritize your list. Do remember the cultural items like ease of use and the types of employees you have and what their expectations are around technology. For example, do you have volunteers who use your CRM? What are they looking for? And what do other successful systems look like at your organization? Keep all that in mind because it's very important later on for user adoption and ultimately implementation success. And remember that vendors have different ways of assigning costs. So do gather information including the numbers of named or concurrent users, the numbers of records in your database today, and your expected growth in terms of record count, because some applications are priced based on record count and some are priced on your user community. Now, there are also a few don'ts of requirements documentation. Don't forget technology-related items like your organization's point of view on software as a service or remote hosting. How much IT support do you get today? How much IT support do you expect will be available in the future? It can be easy to forget technology requirements because they can feel kind of outside our scope of system functionality, but technology can derail a selection process in the end. Information systems departments have their own organizational requirements related to security, architecture, sign-on, etc., for the good of the organization. So don't forget those things. It would be a shame to get through a system selection and have your CIO say no because you left out the IT needs. And don't forget integrations between your CRM and other systems. How are they accomplished today? For example, if your main integration strategy is transferring data between databases using nightly scheduled jobs, and if those jobs are supported by your IT group or built by your IT group or both, and that's their preferred way of building and managing integrations, you don't want to leave that detail out of your requirements document. And don't forget budget. Don't spend your time looking at a system that you can't afford. So what is an RFP or an RFI anyway? Well, RFP stands for Request for Proposal, and RFI stands for Request for Information. And the document itself is an invitation to vendors to provide a written assessment of how their system meets your organization's needs and how much it will cost. Your request document should start with reasons for your selection, and it'll include information that will help the vendor understand how their product might work for your organization. Your goal is to get the best system in place. You want the vendors to be able to prepare a great submission for you. And vendor responses are the first time you get to review and assess the possible fit of a vendor's offerings. So what should you include in your RFP? Well, let's walk through a standard document layout. You could include a section for an introduction to provide background for the selection scope and process. Also, contractual status. This section would state conditions for vendor submissions and rights or non-obligations of your organization. For example, just because you put out an RFP or RFI doesn't mean you have to choose anything. Include a section for vendor process and evaluation criteria. This will describe your organization's selection process and discuss how you will make your decision. How about vendor submission requirements? This would list all materials and forms and responses that a vendor needs to submit for consideration, and include a section for programs and background to provide an overview of the purpose and history of the organization, including details of your current programs and goals, as well as any issues facing the organization that are relevant, and include a requirements overview. This section would present a narrative of the role that technology plays at your organization and an overview of the technical requirements presented by department or functional area. And finally, a detailed checklist. This is the detailed list of system and functional requirements you've been working on. Now, once you've put your request document together, you'll send it to vendors. But first, we recommend research the products in the marketplace that might fit your needs, keeping in mind your top priorities. And the purpose of this step is to eliminate blanketing the vendor world with too many RFPs. An online system that manages peer-to-peer fundraising well, but that doesn't have any major gift fundraising functionality, doesn't need to be included in your short list if peer-to-peer fundraising is not a priority for you and major gift fundraising is. Your goal in this phase is to identify a set of vendors whose applications you predict will have the highest likelihood of meeting your requirements. Now, once you receive responses back from vendors, you'll need to assess and grade them. Here are a few tips to keep in mind as you read and evaluate responses. First of all, no system is going to do everything you want with no customization, so be suspect of any vendor who responds yes to every requirement. And pay attention to budgets and the drivers for pricing. For example, concurrent or named users, record counts, pricing tiers, especially as they pertain to your organization's expected growth. And don't forget to look at things like transaction fees, fees for imports or API calls, or additional modules that might be optional but that are actually necessary. And don't let wish list items drive your analysis, but having your priorities defined will safeguard against this one. And finally, don't waste your time or a vendor's time. Responding to RFPs and analyzing responses takes a lot of time. Don't underestimate it. So we recommend that you don't send your RFP to 10 vendors if you know that 5 of them will never meet your top priority requirements. And now it's demo time. This is what everybody gets excited about. You're going to actually get to see the systems that are competing in your selection process. Now, how do you get what you need from product demos? There are 3 main steps to keep in mind. Step 1 is the step of delivering demo scenarios to the vendors and asking them to stick to the script. Think about your top priorities and describe scenarios you want to see demonstrated by your vendors. Don't dictate how they should do something. Simply describe what it is you want to see. It's important to let the vendor show you how their system works, and you want to see the differences in how one system manages a scenario versus another. Well, what if we skip this step? If you skip it, a couple of things will happen. Number 1, the vendors will only show you what they want you to see. And number 2, you won't see 2 comparable demos. Each demo will be different from the others. And then how will you grade them? How can you compare 2 things that are totally different? Remember, the end goal of the demos is to get a score for each vendor that can be compared to the other scores. Step 2 is to control the demos. You provided the demo scenarios. Now make sure the vendors demonstrate the functionality you said you wanted to see. You will need to appoint someone to keep the demos on track. And step 3, assessing and grading the demos. Here are some tips for grading. We suggest you grade as a group immediately after the demos because the longer you wait, the harder it will be. Demos tend to spill into each other, and the process of watching and grading takes a lot of energy and focus. It really is amazing how quickly things can turn fuzzy when you're watching several multiple day product demos. Limit the voting to the functionality owners. Everybody can have a voice in the process, but everyone's voice shouldn't have the same weight in every area of the system. And vote on what you see. Watch for comments that you might hear like, hey, it's on the roadmap, so that you don't grade functionality that you didn't see and that may not exist yet. And be smart and put items on a parking lot for further conversation or questions if it's required. Don't let a set of questions keep you from grading the demos. Now you've come to the most exciting part of the project. Now you and your team will make your decision. Based on all your hard work, you have figured out exactly what you need, and you've determined which vendor solution is the best for your organization. Once you've decided, announce your decision with information about how the new system will help the organization meet its goals. Expect that the decision may disappoint some people, but your open communication throughout the process should make sure that even if some people disagree or are disappointed, they understand the process you went through and they understand how you ended up at your decision. Thank everyone that was involved and celebrate. And finally, tell the vendors that the process is complete and they either were or were not selected, and get to work signing a contract so you can start implementing the new system. Take advantage of your momentum and everyone's excitement. This is not this time to slow down. And now it's Robert's turn. As I turn it over to Robert Weiner to talk about the 10 common mistakes he has seen. Robert?
Thank you, Donna. So I'm going to talk at you all for a few minutes, and then we will take questions at the end. So you can talk back to us and tell us if this is all making sense to you. The first mistake, and Donna touched on the importance of technical needs, but you don't want techies to make the decision on a fundraising or CRM system. And I'll start by talking about CRM. CRM is a buzzword in our industry now, and it means different things to different organizations and to different vendors. So I have been using the phrase fundraising CRM for what we used to call a donor database or a donor management system, as opposed to a CRM, which tries at least to be an organization-wide, be-all, end-all, all things to all people in your organization tracker of all constituent relationships, which is very hard to achieve. But in any case, whether you're looking for a fundraising CRM or something that is organization-wide, this is not fundamentally a technical decision. You need to involve the right stakeholders. So you need to put together that selection team. It needs to include people who can evaluate the different components that go into that system and make a recommendation to the project manager who is leading that team, who will then make a recommendation to their boss or the leadership team or whoever has the final decision. It should be based on input from all stakeholders, but someone fundamentally needs to decide. On the other hand, it's not just one person's decision. This is going to affect a broad swath of folks at your organization. The next mistake is wishful budgeting, and Donna talked about the importance of looking for systems that fit your budget, but it's very common to not know what your budget is to start with. So in that case, how do you look for systems that can fit your budget? Well, you have to come up with a budget somehow. And there are ways to do this. Some organizations just have a line in their annual budget, and that's what you're going to get to spend. This is what we can afford to throw at the project, and that's all you're going to get. I think a smarter way to do it is some research. So talk to vendors who seem like likely choices. Tell them about your organization through, and you might do this through the RFI or RFP process, or you might have some preliminary conversations if you're allowed to do that. Some of my clients are not allowed to have any conversations with vendors except through the formal process. But if you're allowed to do that, talk to vendors and say, we're expecting to have 200 users and we want everything that you can possibly provide, and give us your worst case scenario for a typical implementation so that you can build your budget based on actual data. If you can't talk to vendors, talk to other similar organizations about what they spent so that you can at least be in the right ballpark, because the prices are hugely variable and your wishes will very likely exceed your budget. So I would love to have an Aston Martin, but I operate in a Mini Cooper world. So there's no way that I'm even going to test drive an Aston Martin because it will just break my heart. The next mistake is prioritizing price above everything. You don't want to pick either the least expensive system simply because it's the least expensive, or the most expensive simply because, oh, it must be so great because it's the most expensive. You need to look at those requirements that Donna talked about earlier and that you've tested the vendors against and make a decision based on your needs. It's fine to accept a donation, and I've had several clients where the vendor really wanted them. So in some cases, it's because the founder of the company, the vendor company, was on the nonprofit's board. In some cases, it's because this was a very prestigious client, and so they were willing to essentially give away the software. It's fine to accept a donation as long as that donation is a product that you would use otherwise. Don't take it simply because they give it to you or give you a big discount on it. It needs to fit your needs. It can be that Donna talked about the wish list versus the must-haves. It can be that the wish list is what differentiates vendors from one another in the final analysis. They can all meet all of your top requirements, and then you can start going further down the list. But again, price is not the decider. And the next mistake is randomly looking at demos. And Donna talked about knowing what your requirements are and identifying a pool of potential vendors, issuing a request for information or for proposals or for qualifications to see if vendors even play in your market and have done what you're trying to do before. Or, you know, on the other hand, if you're willing to take a risk, you might be willing to work with a vendor that has technology that looks really impressive, but they have never done what you're asking them to do before. So you need to know how broadly you want to cast your net. And then, as Donna said, you invite some vendors to present scripted demos. Now, I think everybody on this call is from a big enough organization that you can get a scripted demo. A small nonprofit is very unlikely to get a demo that's tailored to them, but a big nonprofit can get vendors to spend a significant chunk of time going through a variety of use cases about how their software would handle whatever your needs are, whether that's email marketing or gift processing or event setup and registration, et cetera. And then you score those demos as you're going through them. One other step that can be incredibly helpful after going through the demos and doing hands-on testing of the system and checking references, the typical due diligence, is site visits. So, and in fact, I had a client recently who the site visits completely turned around their decision. One vendor blew them away in the demo. They had good references, but when my client went to see sites that were actually using those pieces of software and similarly sized organizations with similar IT staff and similar needs, they completely changed their minds, and it was surprising to them and incredibly helpful. And now they have a built-in user group when they start their implementation who they can turn to and say, you know, how did you make this work? The next mistake is falling in love with cool features, the bells and whistles. So Donna talked about this, so I'm not going to go into it too much. But the vendor is the single most important part of this decision. And the right vendor is going to keep up with changing technologies. They're actually going to build those things that they said were on their roadmap. And that's one thing you can ask about in reference checks or site visits is, does the vendor actually achieve their roadmap on a schedule remotely close to what they say they're going to be able to do? The vendor needs to provide good support and good training and good documentation, and they need to help you implement the system and train your users and document your business processes so that you can use the system consistently over time. The next common mistake is falling in love with the salesperson. And some vendors, the salesperson will become your account executive, and they will continue to be your liaison to whatever kind of problem solving or troubleshooting or service delivery issue needs to be taken care of. But it's very common that you will never see the salesperson again after you sign the contract, except at trade shows. So you are not to fall in love with the salesperson. The salesperson's job is to be charming. The salesperson's job is to make the system look really easy to use. The salesperson uses that system every day, so they have tons of practice going through all of these different steps, which you're not going to have for quite a while. So it's critical to check references and talk to other organizations to make sure that what the salesperson is telling you is really the way the system works, and ideally get a copy of the system that you can work with hands-on and walk through your own script and enter some gifts or send out some email blasts or enter some proposals and actions on your major gift prospects to see how the system really functions. And doing hands-on testing with minimal training, although a big organization can often get training in advance and also get access to the help desk, even though they're not yet a customer. But walking through these steps with minimal training, if any training, will tell you a lot about how usable the system really is in real life. The next mistake, I talked about prioritizing price above everything. The next mistake is buying more than you need. I would love this Ferrari. There is no way on earth I'm going to buy that Ferrari. I live in a house that predates the concept of a garage. So I am not going to even think, no matter how attractive that thing is, I'm not going to go there. So you need to make sure that if you have a Hyundai or a Honda Civic budget, that you are looking at systems that are in the Honda Civic price range, and not get distracted by those cool features and shiny objects. Focus on what you really need the system to do, but also think about growth, because your organization may be adding more staff or going into new forms of fundraising over the next several years, and you need a system that is flexible enough to grow with you to the extent that your crystal ball allows you to see the future. So think ahead, but try to avoid buying the most expensive system or the most feature-rich or most flexible system simply because it can do things that you might never ever need it to do. And the next mistake is thinking that software solves all of your problems. So a new piece of software will make your organization more complicated than it used to be in most cases. So your staff are going to have to learn new skills. They're going to have to be flexible enough to learn new ways of working. If you are going into a true CRM, an organization-wide relationship management system, you're going to have communication between departments at your organization that might not have to have anything to do with each other right now, except sending exports to another department. They may need to cooperate. They may need to agree on codes that will support the entire organization rather than a whole separate set of codes for each department. Your business processes will not magically fix themselves. So if you have broken business processes, they will stay broken unless you address them during the implementation or post-implementation period. And if you have management problems or communication problems, the new software is not going to fix them. So you need to focus on change management and user adoption and bringing people along to understand why this is going to make their lives better. And if you have started with a process that involved the right stakeholders and they were trusted, and they communicated to their peers that this is a good decision, this is going to be so helpful to us, it's going to be a lot of work, you're going to have to learn new things, but it's going to be worth it in the end. If you have managed communication effectively, people should be on board at least with the concept of what they're going to get and be willing to put in the work to redesign business processes, to learn new systems, to work in new ways. The next mistake is hoping that the database is going to install itself, and someone has to be in charge, someone has to manage the project, and that person needs to be given the time to focus on managing the project. If they have a 60-hour-a-week job for which they're being paid for 40 hours a week, and you load this on top of them, they are going to break, and you don't want to break your project manager or your project team, because it's not just a one-person job. It needs to involve representatives from all of the departments that will benefit from the new system. So those folks also need to have the time to participate in the project, and that often means that things need to be taken off of their plates, at least temporarily. You might need to backfill, you might need to give temporary reclasses or increases to some lower level staff to pick up higher level tasks that they don't have to do now. You may need to bring in some consultants or more help from the vendor or specialists to do things that, you know, in theory you could do internally, but in practice, there's no way that you'll have the time to do them. So you need to budget for those if you're going to need to bring in outside help or bring in new staff or temps in order to backfill around the people who are going to be focusing on this project. You also need to think about what other than installing the software and configuring the software, et cetera, what else needs to happen? So how much time are you going to need to devote to cleaning up your data or rethinking your data, rethinking how you're going to track various things? How much time are you going to need to spend integrating this new system with other tools and testing those? So it's not simply installing a piece of software and migrating your old data and everything magically fits. And then the next mistake, which really follows on the previous one, is hoping that the database will run itself after it is live. Someone needs to be in charge going forward, and that's usually the same person who was the project manager of the implementation, assuming that you can incentivize them to stick around, that they don't get so burnt out by being so overloaded during the project. So somebody needs to be responsible for data hygiene, quality control, ongoing training, onboarding new staff, thinking about how your daily operations need to change. You need to think about how people's job duties might need to change if they are having to do things that they didn't have to do in the old system, because the old system only supported one department, and this one they are now supporting 5 departments. You might need more staff to do some of these things, and your existing staff might need new skills. So you might need to send them for professional development beyond just what's offered by the vendor, so that they can learn how other departments that they are now supporting that they didn't used to have to worry about, so they understand how those departments work and what their needs really will be. And then my part of the presentation is called 10 mistakes, but I'm actually going to quickly touch on a couple of other mistakes. So the next is building your own, and I actually started my career 35 years ago as the project manager for a homegrown donor management system for a university. That was before you could buy off-the-shelf systems. I have had a few clients over the years for whom building something custom was truly the right way to go, because no vendor could get them what they needed, at least at a price they could afford. So building your own is not completely off the table, but these days you can generally find a system that is either off the shelf will do what you need, or that is flexible enough that you can, or a consultant who specializes in that particular system can make it do what you need. So starting from scratch is, it's my last resort these days. The next mistake, and I hope that no one in this audience is doing this, but I speak to audiences with a lot of small nonprofits, and there's always somebody, and frequently a lot, who raise their hand and say that they are tracking all of their donors or members or activists or volunteers or whatever in Excel. And Excel is fine for a lot of things, but you cannot track relationships. Well, I won't say you cannot, because I've seen some incredibly creative Excel wizards, but it's really hard to track relationships between people in Excel. It's really hard to track multiple gifts from the same person, or multiple activities, multiple events attended, multiple advocacy actions taken by someone in Excel. It's very hard to create data integrity controls in Excel so that people don't put in the wrong stuff in free text fields. And it's really easy to destroy data in Excel by hitting the wrong key and exiting out and not realizing what you did. So I hope no one is in that situation in this audience, but if you are, you should look for something that is purpose-built to solve your needs and not just use Excel.
Thank you,
So
Robert.
Donna, back to you. You're welcome.
Yeah, thank you so much. So we're going to get to your questions in 1 second, but first, we'd like to get some quick feedback on how valuable this has been for you so far. We've got just a 1-question poll that Allie Davis, our moderator, is going to put up now. We'll start answering questions in just 1 minute. If you guys wouldn't mind answering a poll. Allie, can you put that up?
Yep, it's up right now. We'll leave it up for about 30 seconds, and then we'll move on to the Q&A.
Thank you, everyone. And then once those poll responses come in, Allie, you can gonna flip back to the Q&A slide and start sending us the questions.
Awesome. All right, so we're going to get started. I'm going to close the poll. Thank you so much, everyone, for submitting your responses. I want to start first. I know that a lot of you sent in questions when you registered. Thank you so much for doing that. So I want to start with those. Someone asked, they wanted to know, how do you know that the vendor solution is going to meet your cloud-based systems security rules? They had questions about the data security there.
Donna, would you like to start off on that?
Well, I was going to actually throw it to you, Robert, but the cloud-based security rules, for me, it's about getting those technical requirements from your IT department. And sometimes what you need to do is get the connect your IT, make sure you've got an IT representative in a functional meeting and sometimes you've got to have that IT person perhaps evaluate some of the technical specs from the vendors solutions that you're looking at almost prior to doing anything else. There have been times where when we're running a selection and we know there are some specific requirements that those of us on the functional side don't always understand the intricacies of the IT security requirements, for example. So we might say, hey, here are to the IT folks, here are the specs for the X number of systems that we are looking at. Is there anything here that you need to ask, that we need to be asking specifically, or is there anything here that tells you, hey, this is actually not going to work for us because it's not going to meet our organizational wide security rules.
And so completely agree. The first step, if you have an IT department, if you have a CIO, is to get them involved and to make sure that the vendors understand what the security requirements are that your institution or organization uses internally. Some of my clients are requiring external audits of vendor security, and one of my clients recently asked for both a SOC 1 and SOC 2 report, and not being an auditor, those are things that I can't talk about with any intelligence. but it satisfied the techies on this organization's board that the vendors were doing their own due diligence to protect their systems. One of my clients sought out a contract lawyer who specializes in cloud-based systems to review the proposal from vendors and make sure that it was compliant with current best practices and that the terms of the contract are enforceable. I have had clients, and this has been a while, but there was an article decades ago, back when I was a newbie in this field, but that I thought was such a great concept, which was called How to Test the Security of Your Systems by Breaking into Them. And some of my clients have brought in white hat hackers or students or researchers on their campuses to test vendor systems and see if they can break into them, because it's easy for the vendor to say, oh yeah, we're doing everything possible, but often they're not. So there are a lot of degrees of security consciousness that you can bring to bear on the question.
Thanks. Thank you.
Thank you so much. The next question we have is, how can we check references that aren't supplied by the vendor?
I'll start with that one, Donna.
Yeah.
Oh, go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say, kind of tap into your personal network. Ask, using LinkedIn or perhaps if you're, I mean, a vendor is going to provide references. Obviously, when you provide references, they're referenceable, and typically you're going to expect that if you provide the name, they're going to give you a good reference. I think just mining your own personal networks and finding people, perhaps organizations in your community or in your sphere of influence who use the system that you're thinking about. Sometimes you can find lists of people who attend conferences or who speak at webinars like this one, who are connected with a particular organization, and then you can kind of reach out to them individually to see ask them some specific questions. Robert, would you like to add to that?
Both Donna and I know some of the attendees are involved with AASP, and the Fund Services discussion list is a great place to ask about vendors you're considering, or the conference itself, where you can talk to people face to face. So networking across the industry, networking if you're from a YMCA where Ys have annual conferences, if you're from the Red Cross, which has an annual conference for Red Cross affiliates, you can talk to your peers who are running the same kind of organization. And one thing to do when checking references is to treat them essentially like you're hiring a staff member. So ask the same kinds of questions of every reference, and you can certainly riff off of what you hear, but you want to make sure that you are you're asking about the same kinds of things as you talk to multiple references. And you also want to make sure that those references are similar to you. So if you work at the Red Cross national headquarters, a regional Red Cross will not be a good reference for you, no matter how happy they might be with a particular vendor. You need to talk to references who are similarly sized, that have similar budgets, similar IT support, and that are doing whatever it is they're doing, raising money or running volunteers, et cetera, in a similar way to what you do.
I would agree with all that.
Awesome, thank you. The next one is, how much time should we expect our staff to spend on a system selection?
Robert, do you want to start off?
Sure, more than you want to. It really depends upon, first, what kind of system you're looking for. Second, the size of your organization and how complex your organization is, and then how complex your needs are. So for a small organization, this might be a 3 or 4 month project to select something, and which often seems like way too much time. But for a big organization, it can easily take a year or more to go through the selection process. Because you need to document your requirements. Sometimes you need to hire a consultant to help you document your requirements. You need to document your requirements. You need to shop those around to all the people who had input and make sure that those requirements are correct. You need to prioritize them. You need to do your vendor research, build your budget, develop your demo script, run the demos, grade the demos, and do the follow-up due diligence. So that can take easily a year for a university or a large nonprofit. And then your implementation can take at least as long as your selection did.
Mm-hmm. I would agree. And I think one of the keys to trying to if I could complete a sentence, that would be awesome. One of the keys, I think, to organizing that process and enabling that timeline for selection to be as short as it can be, would be to really understand your decision-making process up front. We didn't really get into this in terms of the system selection steps. We were really focusing on tactical steps around, knowing what it is you need and then just going and finding it. But some organizations get hung up at the end where they're not sure who gets to sort of be the decider. And even though they have perhaps evaluated responses and evaluated demos and graded solutions, and maybe you even look at a score and you can say, well, this solution right here has the highest score. Then it still can be difficult sometimes to pull the trigger and say, okay, this is what we choose now. And so I think working at the very beginning about in terms of with your board, with your leadership, with whoever's got to be involved, whoever those kind of executive stakeholders are who could ultimately say no, get them on board with your process, help them understand that you're going to go through a formal, rigorous process, and in the end, you're going to be able to say to them, here are all the steps that we took, here is the decision that we are making, do we have your blessing, can we have the funding? I think that's very important to have the end game in mind and everybody up front understanding what the process is that you're getting ready to go through.
And one more thing I'll add as far as timing is we talked earlier about doing your research with other similar organizations. Mm-hmm. That is also a question that you can ask up front of similar organizations. How long did it take you to go through this process, and who ran the process and who was involved in the process on both the selection side and the implementation side, so that you can get a ballpark for how your project might go.
Right.
Awesome.
Anything else, Allie?
Yeah, we have one more question. How do I ensure that I have buy-in across the organization?
Buy-in for system selection. Well, I mean, I think you start by, well, you make an assumption that you enter into a system selection because there is an articulated need. Maybe you think there's a need and you do some kind of like gap analysis that determines, yes, there is a need. And I think if you're charged with going through the system selection and what you need to do is you need to look outside your own vertical, your own business unit, and make sure that you're identifying all of the external stakeholders, the other departmental stakeholders who are going to be affected, whether they're being affected because the system that you're choosing it provides information to that other department, or it receives information from that department, and make sure everybody understands the reasons why you are entering into a system selection. I think it's a little bit about the vision casting. You know, I don't think you can really just tell people, hey, we have to go here, and that's so we have to get this new system so that we can get there. You really need to help people understand why the system that you have is not going to get you where you need to go. What is not working today that is unsustainable? That is that means that in order to get to where you can't stay where you are, you have a desire and a need and a goal to get somewhere else in terms of whatever it is, your fundraising capacity, a new campaign that you're starting, getting a better online presence, growing your recurring gifts or your sustainer program, whatever those things are that are articulated as goals. If you can show your stakeholders, if you can demonstrate to them based on fact and based on research why what you're doing now will not get you where you need to go, then you can talk about, and now we're going to undertake a system selection, because you've kind of like you've paved the way for that and helped everybody understand the need. But I think it's about reaching out and making sure that you're inclusive of all the people that are going to be affected and all the departments that are going to be affected. Robert, you got?
I completely agree, and I part of the requirements gathering process can start, and probably should start, it does for me as a consultant, before there's even a decision to change systems. So first, what is working well now? What's not working now? And can we close those gaps without replacing the system? Because sometimes the gaps are not software problems. They're people problems, or they're business process problems, or they're poor communication at the organization, and software is not going to fix that. So first, what's the problem, and articulating that, and having that process led by and involve people who are seen as neutral stakeholders who are respected in the organization, and to approach it so that people feel like this is being done with them and for them, not to them. Because if they feel like this process is being run by or pushed by someone who has an outcome in mind, and that's where we're going, no matter what comes out of the study, no matter what comes out of the requirements, we are going to vendor X, that is going to be a project that people are going to resist at every step along the way. So it truly needs to start from before the requirements gathering, what are the problems, and are they truly system problems, and then involve the right people in gathering those requirements and rating those requirements and participating in the demos and rating them and doing the due diligence, etc., so that it is an open process with good change management along the way. There's one quote I want to pass along for those of you who were at the AASP conference a couple of years ago when Roger Craver was the keynote. He talked about culture eating strategy for breakfast. And I think that is such a great quote in so many contexts. But in this context, if your culture is that your vice president or executive director or CIO is going to make the decision, and people perceive that that's how it's going to go, no matter what they hear from the other stakeholders, you are going to have a very tough time getting buy-in.
I would agree with that. Yeah.
Allie, any other questions?
No, that's all for today. Thank you so much, everyone. Do you guys have any final comments?
Well, I would just say thank you. I think that, I'm going to throw up a slide here in case you don't know all the other things that we do at JCA related to CRM. We're certainly here to help you with selections or any other related projects, and we're always happy to just talk with organizations about their needs and challenges. It's interesting to know kind of what people are up against out in the industry. We'll be sending an email later with links to some helpful resources about planning and selecting a system, and we will also provide access to this recording. And let us know what you think. I'd like to thank Robert very much for participating with us. Robert, I really, really appreciate it. And it was a lot of fun to have you here today. We appreciate your insights. It was great. And for all of you who joined us, thanks for coming and have a great rest of your day.
Thank you for inviting me, Donna.
You're certainly welcome. All right.
Thanks all.
Bye.